G'day YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Contemplating the state of the world, the way it is, and what we, humanity, have done to it. How various people propose to deal with what we've done to it. The time scale, the magnitude of the problem, and how all kinds of stuff is interconnected. And one of the best ways that I've seen recently of trying to get one's head around it is a series of feature articles, 5 feature articles, brought to us by New Scientist magazine, one of my favourite windows into what's going on in the world. They started in February with the idea of what would you do if you had $1 trillion to fix the world? And their first idea was to eradicate world poverty. A one-off payment gives ultra-poor people what they need to escape the poverty trap, often permanently. That's Rio de Janeiro, where many people live on less than $1.90 per day. Equally as easy would be to stop climate change. Men planting trees in Inner Mongolia, China. Afforestation is expensive but pays huge dividends. Carbon capture, a fool's errand. Or you can plant 1 trillion trees. Oh, here's another option. Cure all disease. That'll help with overpopulation, won't it? Universal healthcare. And the coronavirus pandemic has shown that tackling emerging infectious diseases must be a priority. Rowan Hooper is a podcast editor at New Scientist and author of How to Spend $1 Trillion, Profile Books 2021. So that was a bit of a plug, wasn't it? The second feature, 6th of March, spillover, explaining how the COVID-19 pandemic is a direct result of entrepreneurs trashing the environment. For profit, for hire, for reward, for wages, to satisfy market demands, to provide a return on investment, for bright and shiny landfill. A pretty picture of the Nipah virus. We have an explanation of how diseases jump into humans. We have a picture of a pangolin, a scaly mammalian anteater that lives on the forest floor. Thought to be an intermediary animal between the Wuhan horseshoe bat and the bat eaters of Wuhan. Notice that photo on the top strip? That's a rainforest which has experienced progress. We have an in-flight picture of an actual horseshoe bat in a cave. The COVID-19 pandemic was inevitable and will happen again if decisive actions are not taken to protect nature. Adam Vaughan is the chief reporter for New Scientist. So he's at least doing his job. He's not sharpening his axe and selling his book. It would be hard to create a better breeding ground for diseases to jump from animals to humans than live animal markets. Moving forward to the 13th of March, we have the third article. And we have a picture of a western lowland gorilla leaning on the back of a guard in the Bateke Plateau National Park in Gabon. And once again, it's market forces versus resource depletion, habitat destruction, land clearing, progress. A meaty question. And paradoxically, the pandemic has made things worse because with the lockdown, there are no guards, so the poachers don't care about COVID regulations, do they? And then, of course, there are the effects of tourism. And there are still some people living a traditional lifestyle, and they want to be able to continue to hunt and fish. And they don't really appreciate being told that the rest of the world has already reduced the biodiversity and the biomass to the point where if they continue to hunt and fish, there won't be any resources at all. Here's a flavour of it. Economic imperatives. Gallagher highlights the example of Ecuador. There's so much pressure to export products, to export oil, to lease areas in the Amazon for new hydroelectric power plants, not because that was part of their long-term vision, but because they have to do whatever they can to pay those bills right now. The world needs to be able to make sure that we're not burning away our natural assets to get out of this crisis. The economic fallout of the pandemic has a far wider reaching effects. In October, the World Bank estimated that the global recession caused by the pandemic may cause up to 150 million more people, almost 2% of the world's population, to fall into extreme poverty. Historically, prolonged poverty shock has been linked to increases in deforestation and biodiversity loss as products such as fodder, fuel, timber and bushmeat become more necessary both for subsistence and a source of income. You're looking around for whatever you can for something to sell to the world, says Kevin Gallagher, a global development researcher at Boston University. At the same time, rising urban unemployment is causing many people in lower income countries to return to their rural roots, swelling populations in sensitive areas. A UN analysis suggests that by increasing people's reliance on forest goods and services, the pandemic will exacerbate existing pressures on ecosystems caused by climate change, logging and mining activities, forest fires and land conflicts. The Chronic Poverty Advisory Network has been monitoring the effect of COVID-19 on people living in poverty or near poverty in Kenya and Nepal. When the group surveyed people in Viga County in Kenya recently, most rural households reported lower agricultural yields with access to crucial inputs such as fertiliser disrupted and a need to buy or source more food from elsewhere than usual. Respondents in both countries reported an increase in the cost of staple foods. Research suggests that knock-on effects of land degradation and nutrient loss will persist for many growing seasons, increasing pressures on resources such as bushmeat. In many cases, COVID-19 is intensifying pre-existing systemic pressures. Some countries that have a lot of debt distress are also highly biodiverse and highly climate variable, says Gallagher. These include Angola, Cambodia and the Solomon Islands, as well as many in Central and South America. Lots of these countries are already spending anywhere between 30 and 70% of their revenues on servicing external debt, says Gallagher. Natural resources represent one of the few reliable sources of income. So how traditional is that fishy man? Now that the tourists have stopped showing up. We have a little bit of a party piece, excuse the wind, we have a little bit of a party piece concerning cultural burning, which doesn't really happen in Australia because of the sacred fence phenomenon. How can you do cultural burning when you've got to stop your fire before it crosses the neighbour's fence every day? Donna Liu is an Australasia reporter for New Scientist based in Melbourne. So, the techniques are known, they're out there, but numbers. 8.5 billion people. And they all want to make more money this year than they made last year, and they hope to make more money next year than this year. And that means it's really tough if you live in the forest and you're not a human. 27th of March, part 4. The nature fix. Natural spaces are essential for our physical and mental health, and designed in the right way, they can help biodiversity to thrive too, says Kate Douglas. What drugs has Kate Douglas been ingesting? 8 billion, Katie, 8 billion. How much nature do we need? Some of the well-being effects of nature seem to be entirely psychological. The bottom of the scale on the left hand is 1500, 1600, 1700, the year 1800, 1900, 2000, 2050. In red, you've got your urban population. In blue, you've got your rural population. The world has become urbanised. Even minimal green spaces such as this overpass in Osakoko, Japan, boost our mental well-being. Good luck with that. People use green spaces for physical and social activity. Here, Tai Chi in Taiwan. What you mean is Tai Chi on Formosa. Ask any Chinaman. How we plan cities now will affect the well-being of billions in the future. Maybe, perhaps, if the cities are not swamped and overwhelmed by what we've done to the biosphere and every ecology there within. The nature fix in their front cover makes it look like a bunch of syringes. For the progress junkies, on the 10th of the April, following a cover story feature regarding how clever the animals are, how similar their intelligence quotient is to that of humans in terms of its distribution. Monkeys which steal iPads and then go off to a exchange centre and swap the iPads for food, because thieving macaques seem to understand basic economics. Brain sizes, relatively speaking, the human, 1,350 grams, 86 billion neurons. The chimp, 380 grams, 28 billion neurons. The raven, 10.2 grams, 1.2 billion neurons. The mouse, 0.4 of a gram, 71 million neurons. Crows from the Solomon Islands are capable of straightening out paper clips and then rebending them for use as harpoons with which to spear delectable worms that are hiding in cracks in the trees, in the wood. And they do that with less than half an ounce of brain power. They explain how the clever antics of rats aren't merely party tricks. Ask the question, why be so smart? And then the final part of the 5-part feature series, How Climate Change Hits Nature. And we have an eastern grey kangaroo and a joey on a burnt out fire trail in a forest that got cooked. The Great Barrier Reef is already in a critical state. Rising sea temperatures are killing corals faster than they can recover. As temperatures continue to increase, more and more of the reef will die, along with the rich variety of life and the Australian $6 billion tourism, quote, industry, unquote, that depend on it. It is one headline-grabbing example among many. The continued rapid warming of the planet would wipe out many species, even if it were the only change happening. As it is, a 6th mass extinction in Earth's history is already underway as farms replace forests and factory ships overfish the oceans. The heating of the planet will push many struggling species over the brink. Some will just have no place left to go. For biodiversity, climate change is, in military jargon, a threat multiplier. Worse still, measures to limit warming often don't take biodiversity into account. Some, such as the push for biofuels, directly harm it. Yet, there is little that is inevitable about what happens next. We might not be able to save all the species under threat, but we can save an awful lot of them. Quote, we could cut the number of extinctions in half, unquote, says John Weans at the University of Arizona. Quote, I think that's the biggest cause for optimism. The biggest cause for optimism he can think of is that we might be able to only kill half of the species that we are threatening to exterminate. If we choose, and we may not choose, but the fact that we could choose, that's a reason for optimism. Only half the number of species which are currently threatened with extinction are irrevocably already doomed. But our chances are better if we think more smartly about the links between biodiversity loss and climate change and tackle both of these issues together. Done right, a rescue plan for nature can be part of a plan for saving humanity from the worst of climate change and vice versa. The world has warmed around 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. That is already having a dramatic effect on wildlife. In the Arctic, for example, the loss of more and more sea ice each summer is affecting many animals, from walruses to polar bears. Unique species. Polar inhabitants have nowhere colder to go. But many creatures elsewhere are already moving to stay in their comfort zone. Some marine species, including mammals, birds, fish and plankton, have shifted their ranges by hundreds of kilometres. Other effects are more subtle. Oceanic low oxygen zones are expanding because oxygen is less soluble in warm water. This is forcing species such as blue sharks to stay closer to the surface, making them more likely to be caught by fishing boats. Rising sea levels, meanwhile, could wipe out species as low-lying islands are inundated. Mainland species are also at risk, such as the few hundred Bengal tigers in the Sundarbans, a network of mangrove forests along the coast of Bangladesh and northeast India. The effects of habitat destruction and rising water levels mean there will probably be no suitable habitat left there for these tigers by 2070. Not all of those threats are as gradual as the melting of ice caps and the rising of sea levels. Extreme weather fueled by climate change is one example. Hurricane Dorian, one of the strongest Atlantic storms ever recorded, may have wiped out several bird species in the Bahamas, including the Bahama nuthatch and the Abaco parrot. When it hit the islands in 2019, warming-fueled wildfires could also take out species with smaller populations. In 2015, for instance, fires in Western Australia burned much of the remaining habitat of Gilbert's potteroo, one of the world's rarest mammals. A warming world isn't bad news for all species. Some, especially small, highly adaptable and fast reproducing ones, are thriving. But these tend to be things we regard as weeds, pests, or unwanted invaders such as mosquitoes, bark beetles and jellyfish. So far, few species have been conclusively driven to extinction by climate change. The most clear-cut case is the loss of the bramble K. melames, Melames rubicola. This rat-like rodent was found only on its namesake island home, a tiny, low-lying Australian cay on the northern edge of the Great Barrier Reef. It died out sometime after 2009 as rising sea levels led to the island being inundated during storms. Warming may have contributed to other extinctions as well. For example, climate change is thought to have aided the spread of a fungal disease called chytridomycosis that has wiped out nearly 100 amphibian species. So far, Earth hasn't warmed much beyond the bounds of natural variations experienced over the past few million years. But many slower feedbacks, such as the melting of permafrost and the Arctic ice sheet, have barely begun to kick in, so this will change. We are heading into this with wildlife already devastated by our activities. Humans have altered 3/4 of all land and 2/3 of the oceans, according to a major 2019 report on biodiversity. More than 1/3 of land and 3/4 of freshwater resources are devoted to crops or livestock. it is in our own interest to turn things around. The ecosystem services that nature provides for free are worth trillions of dollars and underpin many livelihoods. For instance, hundreds of millions of people depend on coral reefs for tourism and the fish stocks they support, says Ove Ho Goldberg at the University of Queensland in Australia. This is an issue of people as much as it is about ecosystems and biodiversity, he says. By intruding into wild areas and exploiting wildlife, we are also giving pathogens such as the virus causing COVID-19 panic more chances to make the jump into humans or domesticated animals. Warming is generally expected to make matters worse, for example, by allowing disease-carrying tropical mosquitoes to spread more widely. Overall, though, the populations of most plants and animals have been greatly reduced, and they are already in shrinking, often fragmented areas. One study looked at the effect of future climate change on 80,000 species in 35 of the most wildlife-rich areas, including the Amazon rainforest and the Galapagos Islands. With warming of 5 degrees Celsius by around the 2080s, half of those species would no longer be able to survive in those areas. In many parts of the world, even if sustainable habitat remains, many species may not be able to reach it because their paths are blocked by cities, roads, farms, and fences. The same study found that if animals were able to move freely, 2 degrees Celsius of warming would result in the loss of 20% rather than 25% of species. So you could kill 25% less if you just let them move around more. One issue with studies of this kind is that they assume species can't survive outside their current climatic range, but many are already evolving and adapting as their habitats warm. In Finland, for instance, tawny owls are turning brown as snow cover declines. There is a limit to what evolution can achieve, though, especially in species that reproduce slowly. Not only is the climate starting to change much faster than it has during the past few million years, but many species have suffered huge losses of genetic diversity as their numbers have declined. This makes it much harder to adapt to a changing environment. To get a better picture of how wildlife will cope, in a recent study, Wines focused on about 500 plants and animals worldwide. I assume that's species. Looking at where they have already become locally extinct as the world has warmed. His results suggest that what matters most is the maximum annual temperature, not mean temperature, as many other studies assume. Quote, "The most straightforward explanation is that it just literally gets too hot and they die," he says. So do you get that? It doesn't matter what the average temperature is across the whole year, because on the hottest day of the year, that's when the bats fall out of the trees and die of heat stroke. And that's when you've got nothing to pollinate the rainforest. It's the peaks and the troughs that matter. It's the heat waves. It's the intensity of the drought. It's the mega firestorm that kills 3 billion animals in one season. Extinction debt. Despite this, his conclusions are similar to those of many other studies, suggesting that about a third of terrestrial species could be lost altogether by 2070. Quote, "That could be cut in half by following the Paris Agreement and keeping temperature below an increase of about 1.5 degrees, says Wines. As dire as these forecasts are, they may underestimate future extinction risk. There could be a lot more extinctions caused by things like sea level rise," unquote, says Wines. Quote, "There's a whole bunch of other threats," unquote. It can take hundreds or even thousands of years for the full effects of changes such as habitat loss to play out. a phenomenon called extinction debt. In Europe, for instance, the number of extinctions happening today is more strongly linked to what happened a century ago than to current events. One reason is that populations can become unsustainable once they shrink beyond a certain point, and a decline in one species can have knock-on effects on many others, leading to cascading ecological effects. One New Zealand flowering shrub, God almighty, Rhabdothamnus solandri, for example, is slowly declining in numbers after the loss of the birds that pollinated it. Multiplying effects. Some threats to biodiversity can't be forecast with any certainty. For instance, people forced from their homes by disasters or conflict can have a severe impact on biodiversity in the places they flee to, rapidly deforesting vast areas and greatly reducing wildlife populations. Floods and storms displaced 15 million people in 2018 alone, and these numbers will rise as extreme weather keeps on getting more extreme. For some, there will be no going home. Sea level rise will force hundreds of millions of people to move out of low-lying areas over the coming decades. The combined effect of all these threats can multiply and be worse than any one alone. Quote, for example, corals recover from bleaching episodes more slowly when they suffer stress from pollution or damage from coastal development or poorly regulated sport or commercial activities, says Sandra Diaz at the National University of Cordoba in Argentina. Similarly, in tropical forests, unusually hot and dry years combined with the creation of roads greatly increase the chances of destructive fires, she says. On the one hand, these multiplier effects mean that we may be greatly underestimating our impact on biodiversity over the coming century. Quote, our best calculations and projections do not incorporate all the possible cascading and non-linear effects, unquote, says Diaz. Quote, they are on the conservative side, unquote. On the other hand, this shows the importance of protecting and restoring wildlife areas and that the benefits of such actions could be even greater than we think. For instance, creating wildlife corridors or deliberately relocating species to more suitable areas may save those that would otherwise be doomed. For all these reasons, there is growing awareness that climate change and biodiversity are inextricably linked and that we need joined-up policies to tackle both. One consequence is that the separate UN conventions on biodiversity and climate change should be merged, says Eric Dinnerstein of the environmental organisation Resolve in Washington, D.C. The two are so interdependent and the solutions are interdependent, he says. We can't save biodiversity without staying below 1.5 degrees, and we can't stay below 1.5 degrees without saving biodiversity. In general, more has been done to try to tackle climate change than to stem biodiversity loss. Unfortunately, climate policies often show anything but joined-up thinking. Switching farmland to growing energy crops such as oilseed rape increases pressures on land elsewhere. Exhibit A are the various incentives or laws promoting biofuels because they are seen as, quote, green. Quote, there is no doubt that the push for biofuels has seriously harmed biodiversity, says Tim Searchinger at Princeton University. Growing use of biodiesel is responsible for 90% of the increased demand for vegetable oil since 2015, says Searchinger. In Europe, more than half of imported palm oil ends up powering cars, driving the destruction of wildlife and carbon-rich forests in Southeast Asia for palm oil plantations. Europe is also fueling deforestation elsewhere by importing wood to burn for energy, while still counting this as a means to reduce carbon emissions. The fundamental issue that is overlooked is that land is limited. If existing farmland is switched to new uses, such as growing bioenergy crops, more farmland is generally carved out of wild habitats elsewhere, destroying biodiversity and adding carbon to the air in the process. The situation is complex. A few biofuels, mainly those made from genuine waste, can be beneficial overall. But many policies wrongly treat any biofuel as green. With the aviation industry now eyeing biofuels as a way to claim it is limiting emissions, matters could get even worse. If climate policies fail to take biodiversity into account, the reverse is often true too. For instance, efforts to save the Iberian lynx are focused on the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, where conditions will become too dry for the cats this century. Some measures really can help us preserve biodiversity and cut carbon emissions at the same time. In general, areas that are rich in wildlife also store lots of carbon, says Dinnerstein. His team has mapped out what additional areas around the world, for example in the Amazon basin or on Madagascar and Borneo, need to be protected to help the greatest number of species and maximise carbon storage. Many other groups support this approach. This could be done without taking existing farmland out of production and at a relatively low cost, says Dinnerstein. In some places, tree planting with native species may be necessary, but often there is no need. The most effective thing we can do is to allow degraded areas to grow back, he says, rewilding and restoring ecosystems, in other words. Rewilding and restoring ecosystems. In other words, the answer is stop farming. Because it only makes every shit get worse. Rewilding and restoring ecological features. Preserving biodiversity isn't just a fringe benefit of protecting carbon storing trees, but is important to maximise carbon storage. In tropical forests, the largest trees typically have big seeds that are dispersed by animals, says Dinnerstein, and they are the ones that are the most valuable to loggers. If we hunt them out, those massive large-seeded trees are replaced with those with smaller seeds that don't grow as tall, don't grow as large, and they don't sequester as much carbon. Better future. At the same time, we need to slow and eventually halt the clearing of land for farms. Encouraging people to eat less meat would help enormously. If everyone shifted to a plant-based diet, we would only need a quarter of the farmland used now, while vastly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing food. But with meat consumption increasing rather than falling, it is vital to maximise yields on existing farmland. Quote, the expansion of farmland and the associated habitat loss is still very ongoing, says Emma Kovac at the Breakthrough Institute in California. Quote, the intensification of farming can spare habitat for wildlife. A low-intensity organic farm might have more wildlife on it, but it produces less food, which means more farmland is needed elsewhere in the world, she says. Per unit of food, high-intensity farming has a much lower impact. Kovac has shown that if the European Union had embraced higher-yielding genetically engineered crops, it would have led to a substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions via less land use. Despite the dire outlook, many researchers remain optimistic. Quote, I'm incredibly hopeful, unquote, says Dinnerstein. For a start, protecting more land would actually cost relatively little, he says. There is even hope for the coral reefs. Quote, if we stabilise the climate, there is a very good chance that coral reefs will grow back over time, says Hugh Goldberg. Many initiatives and studies around the world show that we can protect biodiversity and tackle climate change while offering a better and fairer future for people, says Diaz. Quote, but these studies also show very clearly that this will only work with very fast, very deep, very bold changes in the way we consume, eat, trade, and value, unquote, she says. Quote, the opportunity to shift gears and do what needs to be done for a better future will close soon. And that was written by Michael LePage, is a biology and environmental reporter for New Scientist. So, the answer is jump in your time machine. Go back 30 years or so. Buy yourself a bit of failed farmland. Purchase the title deed. The bit of paper that says that you get to decide what happens upon that bit of land. And then all you really have to do is protect it from the farmers. Don't graze it, don't plough it, don't seed it, don't harvest it. Let the land restore itself. Because that's what every other thing alive inside your boundaries is trying to do. To rebuild the ecology, to repair the landscape. And it takes time. And during that time, you simply can't attempt to make a profit. Because if you attempt to make a profit out of land that's attempting to restore itself, you will kill it. You will turn it into a desert. You will man-age the landscape until nothing can grow there at all. And of course, if you live in Australia, you can take all those figures about the planet's only warmed 1 degree. That's bullshit. Some parts on the planet are warming faster than others. Australia is warming faster than anywhere except the North Pole and the South Pole. As a continent, Australia is already warmed by 1.35 degrees. And the New England tablelands of northern New South Wales, right here, where this dead tree used to live, we've warmed about 1.8 degrees already so far. So unless something stops the continued industrial scale global emission of carbon or fossil carbon to the atmosphere, all of these trees are probably going to die. They'll all dry out and die of thirst and be burnt out. I feel like I fought a really good holding action. I think I saved a species of frog for about 10 years. But on the whole, too much, too little, too late. The rest of the 8 billion have gone on their own little way, regardless of what people like me might think or say. And the ecology necessary to support a pre-industrial lifestyle does no longer exist anywhere on the planet, because every environmental surplus that used to exist has already been overexploited and fed to the market demand. Initially, that generated by the Europeans, but as they spread out, the Americas and Asia have added to the demand, and these days, apparently China owns about 3/4 of all the natural resources left in Africa. And apparently, the ambition of Premier Xi Jinping is that he wants to become the last emperor on Earth. He wants China to become the last empire on Earth, and in order to achieve that goal, he has to do it before industrial civilization implodes and disappears up its own cloaca. Normally, you could expect a rational person to say that's a terrible thing because it means an increase in the level of conflict. But at the moment, an increase in the level of conflict, together with the bat eater's lament virus and the increasingly intense and increasingly extreme, record-breaking extreme weather events, together they look like they might be the only thing that can rescue the wildlife, because together all those factors may just produce a genetic bottleneck for the human population, make us into an extremely rare species where we can no longer do any damage, and thus leave the rest of the ecology to do its thing and repair the biosphere of the planet. And if any of us survive, any of our descendants are still around after the biosphere has been repaired, then hopefully they will run a less selfish society. But that's a long way in the future. At the moment, all we can worry about is how bad the next fire season's going to get, when all of this shit dries out and is ready to burn. And the problem, as I see it at the moment, is that because so much of the canopy has died, there's a lot more light has come through. And there's a lot of water that the trees would normally have used back when they were alive too. And all that light and all that water has simply turned into head-high grass. And winter's coming, with cold temperatures, the occasional frost and lower rainfall. So unless I can figure out some way to safely burn all this grass, then I'm going to have to do what I've done here and brush cut it, burning 14 mils of petrol per minute. So next fire season should be a Bobby Dazzler, eh? Although it doesn't look too bad, where I've spent the last 3 months brush cutting a donut around the outside of the little bit that I live within. In conclusion, just remember that technological and scientific progress has never ever solved a single one of the problems which it created. Because first, somebody notes an opportunity to overharvest, and then once they've taken everything, they realise they've created a desert, and after they create the desert, they don't bloody well stop. They don't pull their horns in, they don't tighten their belt, they don't stay there and figure out how to live within what's left. Oh shit, no. They get their otherwise unemployable young, strong male population, they arm themselves, and they piss off and conquer somebody else's land and resources. They steal the accumulated wealth of somebody else whose ancestors did a better job of conserving their patch of the planet. Science and technology and progress hasn't solved any problem which it manufactured for itself. What science and technology and progress has allowed the harvest everythingists to do is to go and steal the rest of the world. And fuck it too. So they can satisfy market demand. Onwards and upwards. Progress. Dividends. Oh, bright and shiny landfill, oh, bright and shiny landfill, oh, bright and shiny landfill, for thus we've trashed the earth. How very clever. Warble's on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.